Good morning, everybody. So welcome to the third meeting of the N.E.S.T lecture series. We are very happy to welcome you all. The N.E.S.T Research Network is a wonderful group of postdoc scholars from all over Europe, focusing on how narratives can have an impact on civil societies and so many areas of culture, and we are currently conducting inter and transdisciplinary research on diverse topics. You can discover more about our project on our website, so www.nestresearchnetwork.org if you're interested. And we are implementing our research with the talk of some interesting scholars who have been working on this topic, on narratives, on creating a dialogue between theory and praxis. And today we are very, very happy to be here with Martin Lee Mueller, who will be introduced by Dr. Maria Jura. And so Maria, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you, Martin Lee Mueller, for accepting this invitation to give the talk today. I know we have a lot to learn from you. Actually, my first encounter with Martin was at a climate demonstration in front of the Norwegian Parliament, where he performed a long poem, which I was very struck by. Today, he is the Secretary General of the N.E.S.T Center for Ecology and Philosophy, and he holds a doctorate in philosophy from the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Oslo. He has done many things worth telling about. Some of them he will share himself. I just want to mention his doctoral dissertation titled Being Salmon, Being Human, which is a philosophical and narrative work where he examines Western culture's alienation from nature through a very novel and experimental methodological grip, narrating and imagining the world as a salmon might see it. He is also the father of a beautiful 10-year-old who calls a Rowan her brother and the Baltic Sea her godmother.
Yes.
Martin's work spans across several topics, including human-animal relations, formation and pedagogy, indigenous cosmologies, and the ecology of language. We are looking very much forward to listening to you, Martin. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to you, Stefano, and to you, Maria, for inviting me into this exciting series. I've enjoyed the conversations we've had so far at the library in Oslo and at the fjord site in Oslo, and every other place we've met in the flesh and in the digital realms. And I'm just really looking forward to today, and also especially to the conversation afterwards. So I invite all of you to please stick around and join the conversation afterwards. I would like to start with a poem. This is by a contemporary poet called Gerard Anderson, and the book is called Love Notes from the Hollow Tree. And the poem Can you still hear me? Okay. It just said the host had muted me. So there we go. So this poem is called Eavesdropping. Trees are the way we listen in on the conversation between cosmic energy and earthly matter. The sun posed a question. I didn't quite catch it. Something about hearing all motion as music. Something about galaxies stretching their joints after cramped quarters. Something about vastness as a love language. Not all questions are made of words. Some are tides of heat and light. Some change the listener before they can answer. The earth took its time. Of course it did. A question as kind as sunlight deserves an answer as generous as trees. And I'd like to open up with a small story from my upbringing. You see, I grew up as a boy in lands shaped by glaciers, lands full of sandy soils and pine forests, and lots of lakes and rivers. And twice a year, I experienced something that I didn't have words for at the time, and was sensing more in the body than I was able to express it in any other way. But it often started with a kind of yearning in the body, a yearning that would stretch from my body towards the horizon. And interestingly, once a year, the yearning would move towards the north, and once a year, the yearning would move towards the south. It was as if my body was posing a question to the land and not quite being able to receive an answer, except within days of sensing this yearning inside of me, I could hear the air being filled by the trumpeting calls of thousands and tens of thousands of cranes. And if you haven't heard cranes, I endear all of you at some point later in the day, listen to them. Just listen to the deep trumpeting calls of crane, and then try to imagine to listen to them not through screens and through digital technologies, but try to listen to them with your entire body placed in the landscape, because they fill the air with a different kind of yearning. And yes, I will say yearning, because I have learned from cranes that it is like something to be in the world through different kinds of bodies, a different way of expressing a subjectivity through the flesh, through breath. And because the cranes were migrating through a very narrow corridor that's only about between 10 and 50 kilometers wide, all the tens of thousands of northern, of Baltic and Scandinavian cranes, they would gather and migrate through this corridor, and I happened to be living inside that corridor. So twice a year, this wave would be passing through me, this wave of the migrating calls of the tens of thousands. And I learned at that time to never take for granted any stories, any narratives that outright deny or silence or even kill the voices of the more than human. And in some ways, everything I have done since in my life as a scholar, as an intellectual, as a philosopher, a writer, a teacher, as an artist as well, has been a way of sublimating this early call of the cranes, if you will, a way of responding to their call. Now, of course, nesting inside aliveness through voice is a very interesting theme. If you go back to the early hour of the environmental movement, it started with a call to the possibility that springs may truly become silent, didn't it? The book that really created a movement in the 1960s and onwards was a book that was scientifically very sound and solid, but it was also something else. It also told a story of landscapes falling silent. And it became so powerful, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, I would suggest and argue, both because it was so scientifically sound, it was empirically based, but also because it was able to, through narrative and through the power of metaphor and voice, to touch hearts, and through hearts to really move through people, and then also move through social movement. And that's the starting point. The starting point is we are in the midst of all these voices, and to approach them only through the intellect isn't enough. We're also moved by these voices. We're moved as bodies, we're moved as communities, we're moved through feelings, and we're moved to respond in different ways. And to me, part of the way has been to go into ecophilosophy as a trade, as a way of making an income, as a way of studying, a way of becoming a scholar. But it is also more grounded and deeper. And therefore, I needed to start with the boy in the landscape. And I think that all of you perhaps, and if we have time later, maybe we can exchange some stories of how all of you have echoes inside of you of early voices that have spoken to you and that in some sense still resonate inside your bodies, your minds. And I'd be very curious to listen to your stories and your voices. But one of the themes of my work from the start has been to listen into what Maria, you spoke about, the ecology of language, to listen into the strange acts of denial, of neglect, of silencing, even in how we speak. I'm sure you can all come up with examples, even in the simple acts of speech acts that will speak of trees as it rather than thou. The ways that anthropocentrism still manifests in language, in grammatical structures. And one example I write about in my book, Being Salmon, Being Human, at length, is this supposedly simple sentence: we produce salmon, which is a one-sentence way of describing Norway's second most influential industry after oil, which is the salmon farming industry, which talks about we produce salmon, or we produce biomass, where we are the subject acting upon an object. And it's ingrained even in the way we speak, even in the grammatical structures we use to navigate or map our relationship with aliveness, because grammar, in a way, too, is a way of mapping our relationship with aliveness, isn't it? Now, in the book, I also study indigenous cosmologies, and I come across a very different way of mapping this aliveness through speech, which is salmon gift themselves to us, and we receive them through acts of gratitude, which means that even in grammar, there can be a kind of reciprocity, a mutuality that expresses itself where no voice is ever allowed to become an object. No voice is ever accepted as being anything other than an agent, an agency, or a sentient self, speaking in their own while. So, to make this more concrete, just some examples, because Maria, you asked me to narrate this as much as ground this in theoretical thinking, and we're really trying to navigate between theory and practice. The first time I experimented with this as a scholar was when I went to the Arctic almost 20 years ago to become a research assistant for a marine biologist, and together our work consisted in going out into the ocean every day on a rubber boat and finding killer whales who came close to the coast at the time. This was in winter. This was above the Arctic Circle, and the killer whales came in to find herring and to feed. And our work was to listen. We would drop hydrophones into the ocean, and we would try to listen to their dialects. And to me, as a budding philosopher at the time, it seemed important to argue, to write a thesis based on the assumption that anything worthwhile I'm going to be able to say about our relationship as human beings in a more than human world would need to come from a moral, but also an epistemological or even an ontological stance of listening. In other words, of receiving, of participating in the world through a kind of curiosity that is as grounded and deep as a sense of wonder that we feel, and that we then spend time sublimating into arguments, into more rational kinds of arguments. But I won't say so much about the killer whales, even though I would love to share more with you. But salmon later became an important part of my work, and this kind of gets us deeper into this conversation, because by the time I was able to start a PhD in philosophy, I had just read an opinion piece in the Norwegian Financial Times, Dagens Næringsliv, and the opinion piece was penned by a professor in fishery economics here in Norway, who said, there is a social conflict. Now, we have the salmon farming industry that produces a lot of value for the Norwegian society. It's the second most successful industry in the country. It has been endorsed by kings and crown princes and prime ministers all along. It has been called part of the Norwegian psyche, part of Norwegian identity, as important to Norway as IKEA is to Sweden. These are all quotes from those in power. And And the professor in fishery economics said, the industry has become so important that even though we know that it is killing wild salmon to the point of driving them extinct, of pushing them out of all Norwegian rivers at this time, we have to make an uncomfortable choice. And we ought to be able to accept the extinction of a species. Because what we need to take for granted here is the industry and the values it creates. And if that means letting an entire species go extinct on our watch, in our time, that should be a price we should be able to pay. Now, that was the beginning. And this piece came out at the same time that I received this research grant to do a PhD. And I spent the next 5 years sublimating my rage, thinking about what is the power of story that allows us to argue for the death not only of individual beings, but for the death of entire lineage of aliveness, what we call species, at a time when it is so blaringly obvious to so many of us that we need to be working on ways of co-inhabiting this planet more humbly. How is it that there is no uproar in the streets of Norway to something so life-denying? How is it that this is considered socially accepted? And these are all questions I pose to story. So the thesis as an entirety became a phenomenology of story or of narrative. And as part of the work, I understood I also needed to slip outside dominant narratives and to listen into marginalized narratives of what it is like to be human in relation to salmon. So as part of this PhD research, I did field work on the West Coast, on the Pacific West Coast of North America, in indigenous communities who belong to the Coast Salish communities, who call themselves salmon people and say salmon have been our elders since time immemorial, or since before living memory. And I went not as an anthropologist, but I went as a philosopher with the intention to approach this oral culture, this culture based in spoken words, based in stories, more than axioms and logics and arguments. I intended to approach it as a different kind of wisdom tradition. In other words, a different kind of doing philosophy, because philosophy ultimately is a way of seeking wisdom. And that was important, to not historicize this wisdom tradition and to not otherize the wisdom tradition, but to come and to listen. And what was happening at the time was the case I was working on was the dismantling of 2 large hydropower dams in the Elwha River. At the time, this was considered the biggest dam removal anywhere in the world ever. It was historical. It has only just been surpassed this year by the removal of the Klamath River dams in California. You can read about it. It only just was completed 2 weeks ago. But at the time, the removal of the Elwha dams was historical. Now, when the dams were built 100 years earlier, they had been built based on the story that in the documents, in the records, in the books you can read about the time is called, "We're bringing peace, power, and civilization to the American West." This is settler language, of course. I'm sure you've heard it. Rivers were considered organic machines. Indigenous people were considered either noble savages at best, or more often than not, they were entirely missing from the historical records. They were not even mentioned. Maps were remade and renamed. Stories were rewritten into the way we conceive of landscapes. The land was a terra incognita, an unknown world, and lands were considered unspoken, unstoried, unvoiced. And to this day, if you visit the maps of the region, you still see a lot of this forgetfulness and active denial present in the maps, even as the revoicing and re-narrating is arriving also into mapping. And for example, what used to be called Puget Sound, and in some maps still is increasingly known as the Coast Salish or the Salish Sea, because it is the home to the Salish people, as a way of recognizing original voices. This one episode I'd like to share with you. from that research. I was interviewing a traditional storyteller, and he had asked me to meet him where the ocean meets the land, to not meet inside, but to meet at the crack between ocean and land. And there was a cold fog coming in from the Salish Sea, from the north. And on other days, you would have been able to see Canada in the north because the strait is quite narrow. But on that day, Canada was being swallowed by this wall of white fog. And as the fog was being pushed up the land, I could hear there was a rustling in the undergrowth, in the bushes beside us. And my informant, he was sharing some traditional stories with me, stories of how salmon have been elders and teachers and guiding people into how to come into place over and over again across the generations, across time. And suddenly he stopped. And I didn't know what was going on. And he just motioned me to not speak, into the silence. And then he looked around me. And it was only then that I became truly aware of the rustling of the wind in the branches around us, only through the way that his eyes were directing my attention in the landscape. And into the silence, then he drops just a sentence and he says, "Some of our most sacred songs have no words." Then he remained silent again for a while. And then after some time, he said, "You know, the reason why some of our most sacred songs have no words is because we have to create porous expressions in our culture where we can hear the wind passing through our thinking and our words. We have to be able to always remember where our thinking even comes from," he said. And then we launched into a bigger conversation. I shared with him the story of Descartes, René Descartes, our first modern philosopher who about 400 years ago became the first contemporary philosopher to speak of the entire world as a machine. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It's an important marker in the history of thought in Western tradition. René Descartes, who said the world really consists of two substances and they're radically separate. And one substance is res cogitans, or the thinking mind, and the other substance is res extensa, or extended stuff, which, according to Descartes, is everything other than the human mind, right? And I'm sure you've all heard the famous phrase by Descartes, "I think, therefore I am," right? You've heard that, right? And we talked about this while the wind was still sussing in the woods around us. And I felt a shiver on my skin because it really was quite cold, this fog that was coming in, much colder than the fogs here in Norway that I'm used to. And then he said, "You know, we have something similar in our wisdom tradition. We don't have a word for human," he said, "but we have a phrase for human. And the phrase for human is," now listen to this, the phrase is, "by the pitifulness of our thinking." And then we try to unpack that a little bit, by the pitifulness of our thinking. I'm sure you can hear there is a nearness to Descartes. "I think, therefore I am," one wisdom tradition. The other wisdom tradition talks about by the pitifulness of our thinking. In other words, there's two wisdom traditions with different histories, with different contingencies, how they have arrived to the contemporary wisdom that they still breathe and work with. Both have independently observed the remarkable power of human thinking. There's something utterly beautiful in that, something that deserves to be spoken and, yes, celebrated. Both traditions have put words to that because there's something unique about that. Not unique in the way that it necessarily sets us apart, but unique in the way that it does deserve to be studied and wondered about and spoken about at depths. However, the way in which these two wisdom traditions have interpreted the consequences of that are very, very different. Our tradition, Western philosophy, has said, "I think, therefore I am," which makes me apart, which puts me apart from everything else, which makes me able to, in the words of Francis Bacon, torture nature and torture all her secrets out of her. And that has become a tradition, and that is still feeding into the way we navigate this living, breathing biosphere to this day. And we would need much more time to unpack this, of course. But there's a kind of entitlement and a kind of superiority in that wisdom tradition. The other wisdom tradition says, because we have this remarkable power of thought, which in some sense is infinite, infinitely powerful, we need to always find cultural ways of embedding that infinite power into breathing landscapes, whom we co-inhabit with other beings who speak in other ways. And often they don't speak in verbal tongues. Often they will speak through other expressive modes. They will be embodied modes, modes of navigating the landscape through voice, such as cranes, or navigating the riverscapes through the sheer power of their life cycle, such as salmon, who don't speak or don't articulate in any way that resonates with the human sensory apparatus, but who still have a kind of expressiveness. And it is an expressiveness that we can interpret through story, through song, through seasonal ritual, and so on and so forth. I'll put a period to this. Now this, what I've been telling you so far, has been some of the core work of the PhD period, and which led to the thesis that Maria, that you've mentioned, Being Salmon, Being Human, a Phenomenology of Story. And since then, this was in 2016, I've continued pursuing the question of how we are inside aliveness through voice. It really is becoming a bigger theme and a broader theme. And I'd like to just mention some examples of how I've been looking into this, not only as a scholar, but also as a member of community and as a storyteller and as an artist. When the book came out, a year after the PhD was completed, colleagues came to me who are professional storytellers here in Norway. There is a vibrant storytelling scene here in Norway, or community, which practices oral tradition for our time, and suggested, let's turn the book into a storytelling performance for the stage. And we did. And for the next 5 years, until COVID hit, and throughout COVID and beyond COVID too, we traveled the Northern Hemisphere in multiple installments to bring the storytelling performance, Being Salmon, Being Human, to local river communities who in one way or another have living relationships with salmon. Not only indigenous communities, but also others. We went to the Sami homelands called Sapmi here in Scandinavia. Twice we were in North America along the Great Lakes and also on the West Coast. We traveled the UK and I've had many shows in schools, at conferences, and once we also played at the UN Climate Summit COP26 in Glasgow to bring this conversation to climate negotiations. And in the performance, we collaborate with a Sami yoiker. Perhaps not all of you have heard of Sami yoik. It's a vocal tradition that is not unlike Mongolian overtone growling and chanting. And our friend, the yoiker, his name is Torgeir Vasvik, he will say yoik may be the oldest living vocal tradition in Europe. It may have an unbroken lineage and have been practiced for 30,000 years, he says, which means way into the most recent ice age, based on his own testimonial coming from within the tradition. And he will say the yoik often doesn't have words either. And isn't that interesting? Again, we have a vocal tradition saying sometimes words can come in the way of a deeper understanding and of a deeper way of relating through voice between our human bodies and the larger bodies that envelop us and surround us and hold us and sustain us and nourish us with breath and with the gravity that holds us afloat or on this ground. Sometimes we need wordless voice. So the yoik will insist on that as well. And the yoik is the vocal tradition which is all about the possibility of becoming transparent, of shape-shifting, of not yoiking about a rock or about a wolf or a salmon, but yoiking the rock into presence, yoiking an immediate rapport with a specific bear in the landscape or a tree. And it is a way of remaining porous. It is a cultural way of remaining, of opening and keeping porous, a state of awe and wonder. A question as kind as a rock in the landscape, or a question as ancient as salmon runs in the landscape, requires and deserves, perhaps I would argue, answers as generous as remaining and always remaining in a state of curiosity and sensitivity to the possibilities that we are surrounded by more than human others. We've done other work as well. Once we did a virtual reality production called The Bone, which you can find if you search for it. It's called The Bone, in collaboration with a Chilean visual artist. And we had a studio in Berlin of 12 graphic designers who created the world for us. And it too was a way of exploring the possibility of narrative. Because in The Bone, we wrote 2 manuscripts, one script from the point of from the embodied perspective of a wild salmon coming into her senses in an articulate ocean full of voice and full of rhythm and sound. That was one narrative we wrote. The other narrative we were asked to write was, how does a captive salmon in a cage who spends her life entire within cages, how does she come into her senses, into the kinds of more staccato kinds of rhythms, the more industrial, the more technical kinds of rhythms, from a strictly phenomenological point of view, not judging, not interpreting, only strictly writing through the body. What would it be like to come into that kind of body? A body who at times in the industry is forced to grow faster because the industry has found out that it can accelerate even time. It can make industrial halls that are closed from the land and closed from solar patterns, where it can make 23-hour daily rhythms. And when it does that over time, and the salmon will be in tanks in this factory hall, the salmon who are used and who are born to tuning into cues from the land, in other words, to listening to the speech of the land and tuning in their growth pattern to that, the salmon will grow faster because time is literally accelerated. So what would that be like to experience that sort of different kind of tuning from the body? This is what these were the questions we explored in this art piece called The Bone, and it has traveled. It has played in Moscow, also in Santiago de Chile, in Norway, also in Berlin, in a German translation, and also in Canada. And it is still traveling festivals across the world. We've made a documentary film with a high school here in Oslo, in Norway, where we spent 1 year during COVID, actually, with students exploring the local salmon in our local river, the Akerselva River, and giving the students the agency to become the directors and the writers of the piece. And we would support them with the knowledge that they would ask from us. And the students ended up spending this year preparing a film to be premiered when our local salmon would come back in November of the next year to spawn in downtown Oslo in the river. And the film was scheduled to be premiered in tandem with this event in the landscape. The students did, and they completed it. And during the film, they too, on their own, decided, we want to explore this from the point of view of fish. We want to explore the possibility that it is like something to be another being. Unlike Thomas Nagel, when he asked in the 1970s what is it like to be a bat, and concluded more or less we cannot ever know because we're too different, these students would say, well, we have bodies, and our bodies can help translate us perspectives. We too know what it is like to sense heat and cold. We too know what it's like to be in rhythm with seasonal cycles, to taste the landscape differently after a rain shower, because moisture in the air, and for that matter in water, makes us more alert to taste and to smell. And when we know that, then we also know, and then we also have a way of poetically, through narrative, again through the ecology of language, to gradually open up a different kind of sensitivity for the possibility of being a fish. As strange as that may sound, to use the power of language carefully translated with the whole breathing body in landscape, to expand our possibility for empathy, to expand our possibility for a moral capacity, and through that to really deepen and to deepen this world and our sensation of what it is like to be breathing in this world. As David Abram, my mentor, has said early in his own work, we're many sets of eyes who look out upon the same breathing planet, all of us from within our own bodies. Now, I see that we have not so much time left. So I'll mention just a few more things, and there's really so much more to say. Just a few other examples of how we've worked, because Maria, you said it might be relevant to name some examples. We also every year invite school classes to the river when the salmon spawn, and we spend an entire day with each school class working on narrative, sharing some traditional stories about salmon homecoming from other places, and through that working on opening up a curiosity for the events in this place, in this landscape, because we do it on the riverside when the salmon spawn. And this year, the salmon have just returned. I only just saw them for the first time this season, this past weekend. So they're coming back right now and preparing themselves to spawn. We've also created a festival for the river in downtown Oslo, a homecoming festival for salmon, where, again, we come to the festival from a point of view of narrative. This river has been extinct twice in historical time. The first time the river was killed through the actions of humans was during the Industrial Revolution, when the Akerselva River became a sewage canal like so many European rivers in the 19th century. And in the case of our river, it became quite clinically dead. And we have historical accounts from that period of people sitting by the riverside, dreaming of impossible futures where the river will again give life to people falling in love with her, but it seemed utterly unimaginable at the time. It's in the records, but the records also say this is likely never going to come this time. The imagination wasn't able to push through the realities of the lands and the waters at the time, but it was still exerting a kind of pressure on the future, as the imagination can do. The second time the river was extinct was only 12 years ago by a freak accident, when one night 12,000 liters of chlorine spilled into the river from a water purifying plant at the headwaters of the river, because the river is also part of the drinking water network for the entire city of Oslo. That chlorine spill also killed the river quite clinically overnight, entirely. Some say you could see waterfowl, birds belly upping on the surface. You could see fish belly upping on the surface. Those who studied it say that even the microbes went dead. We decided we will approach this festival from a point of view of what David Abram calls not only restoring landscapes, but restoring our relationships with landscapes. Restoring relationships with landscapes. Because this is a time when stories of decline, despair, grief, collapse abound. And I'm sure we all know this by Broken Heart, this story. And we decided, let's experiment with the kinds of stories that can come even after extinction. Not the kind of it's 5 to 12 stories that are also important, the warning kind of narratives. But what about places that have already been extinct once or multiple times? And what about the possibilities for more aliveness in the ecology of the land, but also in the ecology of human voices, to still keep returning to these places and to find new opportunities for a deeper kind of listening? And that was, and for very real concrete changes in the landscape. So that was the basic starting premise of this Motströms festival, or Against the Current, as it's called. And now it is happening every year in November when the salmon spawn. So at the core, it is a homecoming festival, a ritual to welcome them home. But around that, in more philosophical terms or artistic terms, we are exploring over time, over longer periods of time, possibilities for new stories to emerge from that. Songs, artistic expressions, ways in which we do schooling, ways in which we learn to co-inhabit places again and again and again. And I see that clock time is asking me to take a deep breath here. So I will close with one more poem. There's always more to say, but we can take some of it in conversation. But I do want to honor clock time. So I will close this with a poem by Gary Snyder. And the poem is called Without. The silence of nature within. The power within, the power without. The path is whatever passes, no end in itself. The end is grace, ease, healing, not saving, singing the proof of the power within. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Martin. And we thank you for this wonderful wisdom that you share with us. So many inputs, and I am sure that many people will watch this video. And I think that if they're interested, they contact you and go through your books, and you may definitely provide more information regarding your wonderful work. And instead, if you're interested in N.E.S.T, visit our website or contact us. We'll be very happy to continue this conversation. Thank you, Martin.